5 gentlemen, there's no ladies here, and a pipe. Um, well, I wonder, maybe one of the first problems that might come up later is that there weren't any women on this panel and there might be different kind of argument to offer. But when I saw the title of the panel, the first thing that struck me was that as in literature, so in the panel too, it was the writer's critic and writer came before critic. And I was wondering if we should start by thinking of the critic as writer first. And I wanted to ask all 4 of you, when you've all written criticism and when you think of the critic as writer, are the standards you set yourself as critics separate from the standards you set yourself as writers of creative work? And if those, what are those standards and how do they connect up with the rest of literature? Nicholson, would you like to start? You're just going to have to let me choose each time.
Well, when you try, I guess the key for me, when I'm trying to write a book review or some sort of work of criticism that makes sense of somebody else, the first hurdle that I have to cross is that I want to sound sane. You know, I want to sound like I'm a man of the world, that I've seen a lot of things, I've read a lot of books. Prose just comes easily off my fingertips and all that. When you're writing an actual work of fiction, sometimes you want your character to be eccentric, limited, mistaken. So the act of criticism, I find I have to rev myself up by actually reading some of the great 19th century critics like George Saintsbury. Well, I mainly read George Saintsbury because he's so smart and so fluent. And then I read some of the good 20th century critics. Hazlitt is good for a laugh, but when I read, then I get my brain going in that kind of fluent thing. I read a little De Quincey and stuff, and then the words start to come out in a different way. So being a critic is choosing to have a more normal, I guess, a more normal but learned voice.
Amit, would you like to answer that too? Because you've written novels, and I think even your criticism is very interesting, that sometimes there's a lot of very close reading in it and sometimes more like history of ideas. And so perhaps you have a sense of where they all fit together?
It's a very interesting question. I mean, an interesting take on the whole writer-critic thing. But I don't know if I have I'm trying to think my way through on my feet. I mean, I think one of the things, well, I began to write criticism quite early as I began to write fiction, mainly because I thought that the kind of fiction I was writing didn't, I mean, one of the reasons was I thought that the fiction I was writing didn't quite fit into the sort of fiction that you were supposed to write as an Indian writer in English after 1981 or whatever, the Midnight's Children, all of that. So it didn't seem to fit in. It seemed to have a modernist provenance, and that kind of wasn't getting talked about at all. So I was trying to find out where these origins might be for the kind of writing I was doing, besides, let's say, a reading of Virginia Woolf, etc., etc. So that's one of the reasons why I began to write and think critically. I was always interested in literature, which is why I never even thought of studying creative writing, though I do have to teach it sometimes. But as time went on, say, like by 1999, by which time I'd written and published 3 novels in the UK and here in India, and by that time, it did seem to me that to be a novelist, firstly, meant to represent a world, and in my case, maybe to represent India, being an Indian novelist, but also, so novels were representative of the world, and the novelist was a writer who produced novels periodically. So, like a cow produces milk, the novelist was there to produce novels every 2 years. So the novel was there to give you the world, and the novelist was there to give you the novel, which gave you the world. And this kind of series of linkages seemed oppressive. I thought, why must the novel give you the world? And why must the novelist, as writer, give you the novel? Every 2 years, ideally, as the publisher wanted, because to keep your backlist alive and all of that. So I began to think more militantly then about moving out of the novel into writing other things, and in fact bringing to this kind of hierarchy between writer of novels and then writer of essays or criticism, to bring to that a different kind of interrogation based upon a sense of discomfiture of the almost organic quality of being a novelist. That the novelist was somehow organically whole and connected to the world he was representing periodically in a particular kind of way. I didn't like that.
Will, are you a different self when you're writing criticism than when you're writing novels? Well, no, it's not in this case, but it could be later.
It's a really clever one. You think I'm being facetious?
No, I thought you
No, I'm not. I'm being utterly sincere. That's the funniest play on my name I've ever heard. It was well worth flying here for that. I think the distinction between being a critic and being a writer of fiction is the distinction between authority and authenticity. You know, paradoxically, a critic needs to be more authoritative than a writer of fictions, because the critic needs to establish themselves in the reader's mind as, you know, being on the loftiest peak, looking down on the great world of literature and able to pronounce authoritatively on it. With this caveat, most literary criticism that it appears in newspaper or periodical form is journalism, just like any other journalism. And the aim of journalism, you know, as H.L. Mencken said, should be to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. It's an entertainment, fundamentally. So you're kind of, you know, but there is a certain kind of literary criticism, obviously, that marches closer to the academy, that seeks, and all these forms of criticism should try and be authoritative or impress upon the reader the idea that the author is authoritative, or else why would they bother to read your criticism? They must feel intrinsically that your opinion is worthwhile. But fiction, you know, fiction can always be naive art in you know, Schelling's formulation. It can always just be an outgrowth. And why I attach the word authenticity to it is because there is a distinction, it seems to me, between authenticity of voice and authority of voice. The reader of fiction needs to feel that whether it's the narrator's voice or the characters, doesn't matter whether it's diegesis or mimesis, they must feel that it's authentic. It's real in some sense. It's real to them and it's real to the writer. Different in criticism. But each critical piece, bearing in mind it's journalism, I mean, there's nothing more fun than getting up in the morning in the fullness of middle age and giving another writer's work, as we say in English, a real shitbagging.
I'm sure you've terrified a lot of writers in the audience with that one line. Alberto, you're a somewhat gentler critic, and you've written a book called A History of Reading. And in the morning we were having a chat at a different event, and we had some talks about how the history of literature is separate from the history of reading. Is the history of criticism closer to the history of reading? When we read, are we, whether we like it or not, exercising our critical faculties?
Yeah, so obviously, just by saying I like this and I don't like this. But what I find surprising, and I ask myself why I do it, there are two activities that I am very fond of, one more than the other. The activity I am most fond of is reading. And it's a private activity, and sometimes when you're very enthusiastic about something you've read, you grab a friend by the arm and say, you have to read this.
And then I like writing, but it's more of an effort, especially writing fiction, when you have to invent everything. You have to pretend that it comes from real life, but you have to invent the face of the characters and the place where the action takes place and the story and so on. And it's a lot of work. But I like doing it. But why do I take it to another level? Why, for instance, when I write, I scribble, and got some stories, do I try to turn it into a book that my publisher will accept and that the reader might read? Why do I take that other step? Borges, whom we spoke about this morning, used to say that he loved to think up the plots of stories, but that writing a novel was an exaggeration. So he would write prefaces and summaries of books that he never wrote. And the business of criticism, of taking that reading one step further and inventing, because after all it's invention, inventing reasons why you like or you dislike a book, and trying to achieve a certain balance so that people will not think that you're simply saying, I like this or I don't like this, but that you're giving reasons for your taste, which you are inventing as you go. Why do we do this? I know that I write reviews because I need to earn the money, but that's not a justification for my writing of novels.
Okay. Nicholson, you wrote a book devoted entirely to John Updike. Why did you choose to do that? Why did you feel that it was necessary to do that?
Well, I'd written a book about riding an escalator, and I'd written a book about sitting in a rocking chair, and it seemed like the obvious next step. The thing was that I thought there are these beautiful things called book reviews, and they exist in the Times Literary Supplement and the New York Review of Books and London Review of Books, and I admire them a great deal, and I aspire to have that kind of voice. However, they're completely untrue to my own experience of reading. So what I tried to do was write a book that was truer to the way we actually think about a writer when we're living. Think, any person in this audience probably has a favorite writer, and you think, what do I really like about that person? What phrases, what images, what moments in their books? And there will be a list of things. So I thought, okay, I'm going to write a whole book about John Updike, a person I have been somewhat obsessed with. I wrote it when I was 29 or 31, I guess, for some number of years. So I have phrases in my mind, but I will not prepare myself to write the book. I will not sort of load RAM full of Updike in order to spit out a kind of reasoned chronological criticism of him. Instead, I will write the book the way it comes out, and I will only be able to use as phrases to quote from him the phrases that I actually remember from Updike. So I thought, aha, I have invented a new kind of criticism called memory criticism, in which it's entirely dependent on my very fallible memory. Fortunately, then I got to go back and, in brackets, correct my misquotations afterwards. But the idea was to be more truthful about the way we think through writing and think about a writer as part of our lives. I mean, sometimes we're jealous. Sometimes we disapprove of a later novel by a writer we really like. Sometimes we think, that is a horrible chapter. Why is he so mean in that chapter to that character? And it actually is upsetting, you know? So I wanted to have a more emotional involvement with this writer who fascinated me because he was sort of the king of American letters at the time. And to be more truthful about it. I wanted to tell the truth about reading, actually. That was my ambition.
Will, do you think the best criticism is written either out of a deep love for the subject at hand or deep distaste?
Well, I think without being too gushing, We don't like gushing, except from taps. The Nicholson's book on John Updike was a really brilliant book and a really timely corrective. I mean, I read it when it was published, to the oracular quality of a lot of criticism, which is smoke and mirrors, it's fakery. Even the critics who you most admire, who are genuinely erudite people, haven't read as much as they pretend to read. It comes back to what I said initially about authority. The trick of being a successful critic in that you get commissioned and you get read is to have this air of authority. And there are all sorts of little cheaty ways of doing it. One is basically to pretend you've read more than you have, particularly to pretend that you are completely familiar with the oeuvre of the writer who you're reviewing. And we all do it. We basically lie. We don't do it directly, we just do a little bit of subterfuge. And that's why Nicholson's book was so brilliant, because he unwrapped that particular thing. And what, as he said himself, what he exposed was the reality, the slippery reality of our relationship, both with texts and their authors, which is overlain by all sorts of perfectly irrational prejudices, ideas about who the writer is, assumptions about the things they're writing about. And it's very, very difficult. I mean, coming back to your initial question, it's very, very difficult, to know whether you love something or hate something because of qualities that are intrinsic to it or to you. I mean, in as much as that's true of our relationship with the world in every respect. And again, it would be disingenuous for any writer or critic to pretend that they have any kind of objectivity. There's a certain kind of reviewing in the English-speaking world, and it hasn't, in the 18th century, it would have been called flighting, that is kind of deliberately attacking the writer. There's a big tradition in England in particular of ad hominem reviewing, reviewing the person, not the book. It's all part of the rough and tumble of the English literary lifestyle, but frankly it's not really very edifying. But it is fun. And then, you reach a point where you've expended quite a lot of bile and you're feeling like a kind of nasty person, and you say to the editors you work for, oh no, I only want to review things I like, because that way I can be really positive. And I want to encourage everybody to read. I don't want to read things I don't like. Everything must be nice and likable. And that's bullshit too. That's just bullshit too. That's just an attempt to make yourself feel good about yourself. And the truth of the matter is, you just got to soldier on regardless. Everybody sitting here is a jobbing writer. We all have had to write for our living. None of us are dilettantes with a private income. You just get on with it.
Amit, when we write essays as literary critics or as jobbing writers, often you respond to something that's been given to you and you don't know until you read the book what you think about it. But afterwards, you not only publish essays, you publish essay collections where you've been able to put them together. And do you feel that when you read a single essay by a critic, you have some sense of somebody's sensibility, but when you read a book of essays, you have some sense of his or her method? And there's a kind of scaling up on the part of both the critic and the writer when you get to a book-length collection, even though the subjects are very disparate within it.
Can you give me some examples of these essay collections?
Well, something like V.S. Pritchett, for instance, the English tradition. He had a fantastic range, and you begin to buy his books not because you were interested in the writers he was talking about, but more in like the sort of like the range of his mind, and that you could pick up all these different material from across traditions and find some way to put it all together.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of essay collections that have been illuminating to me in that particular way. My mind goes back to studies in classic American literature by D.H. Lawrence. But then, if I were to talk about discovering an essayist, then I would have to go back to your earlier question about hierarchies between, being a novelist and being an essayist. And so I'm opening it out a little bit outside of just writing criticism. Into being still being a jobbing writer and writing your kind of daily piece of journalism or your weekly piece of journalism. And of course, the discovery for us, at least for me, has been George Orwell. Who to me, I mean, for a long time when I was growing up, when I was kind of 12 years old, was known to me as a novelist. 1984 Animal Farm, and then a writer of certain long pieces of non-fiction. But it's only later that one became aware of these essays that he'd been writing as kind of partly maybe even as hack writing, in praise of tea, in praise of English food, and all kinds of unlikely subjects, in which you see a certain kind of joy coming into being, which only happens when the writer is, even if he's jobbing, even if he's kind of doing some hack piece of work, is actually no longer in the domain of responsibility and expectation. So he's now outside of, is doing something that's no longer expected of him. And that produces a certain kind of joyousness, which I think is the essence of writing, and even what makes some of the etchings and drawings that great painters do more interesting and alive sometimes than their paintings, which is so true of some of the great painters of the Renaissance, where the paintings are done on this huge scale and are in some sense admirable and deeply boring. And then you turn to their drawings and you find something alive. And this again goes to the question of whether the critic necessarily, if he's also a novelist, has to be authoritative, or whether he can be free in some way. And this is where the drawing comes in, and where Orwell's kind of daily pieces about dailiness come in. And so for me, discovering Orwell in that way, and I think for the world to discover Orwell in that way, I think the world discovered Orwell in that way in the 80s, in the 90s. And it began to discover all kinds of writers in that way, in terms of being something more than what we thought they were. I'll give you other examples. Maybe it's just kind of an interesting addendum on this whole idea of what writers do when they're not expected to be doing what they're supposed to be doing. Camus, for instance, is another such essayist. I mean, when I was growing up, all I knew about Camus was, the world is a deeply miserable mistake, and it's a misreading of Camus. But it's only later, with the posthumous publication, The First Man, but also these various essays, that you find out about Camus' carnality, his joy in life, and his love of Algeria, and his deep homesickness in Paris and in the European city. So when writers are doing things which they are not necessarily part of their job description, the job description that made them famous, I think there you come to the heart of what might actually last in what they've actually produced.
Thank you. Alberto, one of the most revelatory essays I read when I was trying to become a writer in my 20s was something from Into the Looking Glass Wood, where it suddenly struck me that not all criticism needs to be by one writer about another writer, or even about a culture or an age. It could also be about a language and an entire vocabulary within that language. And it was the chapter where you write about how difficult it is to write a convincing sex scene in English. And I wondered if you could quickly reprise the argument, and whether you still believe in it completely, or if you have found something in other books that sort of negates it.
Well, in that sense, I've always found it very difficult to enjoy description of sex in writing. I found it done successfully in a few Spanish, French novels, but very few English novels, because I find that the vocabulary of sex in English is either clinical or schoolboyish or schoolgirlish. So if pornography, which I read for scientific interest, makes me laugh most of the time, or sometimes I find it boring. So I don't know if it can be successful, the most successful erotic scenes in literature have been in mystical poetry. I don't know, for instance, in Spanish, a writer who is more erotic than Saint John of the Cross when speaking of the lover in The Lover Transformed, when in Spanish the word transformada includes, not etymologically, but phonetically, the word beloved. So it's beloved, beloved in the beloved. I think in mystic poetry you find that in Rumi, for instance, and in much pre-Islamic poetry as well. But in English, I think it's very hard. But you should be asking Will Self the question, because he's an expert in the subject.
He's looking a bit skeptical. I'm not sure if he...
Sorry, I'm not sure what I'm an expert on. Having sex or writing about it? I mean, I'm not aware of having made love to you, Alberto, but my experience is so wide.
We should not go into intimate details. We're speaking as critics here.
I think Alberto's made the right point. I mean, the problem, sure, but I think it's wrong to single out English. It may appear particularly plangent to you because it's not your first language, but it seems to me the problem is with the metaphoric quality of sexual interaction itself, which is that the psyche cannot directly involve itself with the apprehension of physical being in another existent person. So we euphemize it even as we are experiencing it. If you think about your own sexual experiences, I'll give you 30 seconds to do that now. So, you know what I'm talking about, right?
I wasn't quite ready yet, but I'll go back to it some other time. Is the distinction between, I think it's because of the way the literary market is set up and the way the economics of literature is set up and the way journalism and literature is set up, it's common to think of criticism as secondary to literature and dependent, it's a reflective art dependent on the expressive arts. But is this a false distinction, and can you read a critic as much as any other expressive writer for pleasure, and sometimes even more so? Nicholson, I would like all of you to answer it, so maybe you could start first.
Well, you mentioned V.S. Pritchett, and I have been on a V.S. Pritchett jag recently, and I think there's something really lovely about. Now, first of all, I want to say I have written 3 porn novels. Okay, so I have tried, and it obviously didn't work with either of these 2 gentlemen, and I'm sorry, but I really tried in English to describe sex, and I came up with lots of metaphors and everything, so I'm just sorry. It didn't work. But anyway, the V.S. Pritchett is a guy who just reads and thinks about, he reads all the Russians, and he reads the Italians, and he just goes through stuff. And I find that if I start my day, there's an enormous collection of V.S. Pritchett's criticism. It's about this thick. I open at random, and I start reading aloud what this man decided to write about these different classical, or sometimes recent writers, that it makes me happy. It makes me happy. I feel that I am learning something intimate about the writers, but also about V.S. Pritchett, and something that's terribly important to him, maybe more important to him than some of the things that he put in his novels. And in truth, I have never read any V.S. Pritchett novels. So, I mean, I think criticism can be a beautiful kind of early morning experience, you know. It can wake you up.
Like sex.
Amit, would you like to answer the same question?
You're still thinking. He's still thinking. Bless. Yeah, I mean, I think there are some very great, I mean, Hazlitt was touched on, but he didn't really write fiction. There are some people, there are some critical writers who kind of do a lot of what fiction writers do. I mean, the one that would pop up for me is De Quincey, who, you know, he has all the attributes of what I would think of as a serious novelist, i.e. a philosophic novelist, but he doesn't really write fiction in that way. Then I think there's a kind of group, you know, and I would include Proust and Nabokov in that category, where there is a very, very fruitful cross-insemination between their critical writing and their fiction, you know, whether it's between Contre Sainte-Beuve and À la Recherche, or whether it's between, you know, Nabokov's lectures on literature and the novels of that period when he was at Cornell in the late 50s. There's a kind of synergy there and an interaction, but I'm sorry, I'm going to have to be kind of boring and pedestrian about this. You know, in my heart of hearts, I'm a fiction writer. I'm not a critic. You know, to me, the people who are it is a different muscle, ultimately. Ultimately, it's a different muscle. And you can be a very, very great critic, in my view, and you couldn't write fiction if I held a gun to your head. You really couldn't. Whereas I'm afraid most good fiction writers absolutely can write criticism if they need to. You know, they may not be great critics, but they can do it. So, you know, it's different in that way. And I never go to criticism for what I'm seeking in fiction. Ever, really. You'll get something like it, or a variation on it, but it's not the same thing. There's something intrinsically different about it. Now you're on. You can't dodge the bullet any longer.
You know, I mean, I don't know about this kind of this muscle that some people have, which is innate to the fiction writer. I sort of enjoy imaginative writing of any kind, and I do think that given that, and I'll try to come to your question about whether criticism or non-fiction writing or essay writing can in itself be as valid a form of imaginative expression as a work, a novel or a story. But I think the novel is kind of in our minds to a certain degree shackled to certain 19th century, 18th, 19th century ideas of what the novel is and how it represents reality and the conventions by which you represent reality, and there are many people who tried to kind of break out of that in ways which may have taken a cue from the essay. Virginia Woolf, for instance, and others. You mentioned Proust. It's only Junichiro Tanizaki who actually calls those kinds of writings of his, which are still fiction, essays. He says these are essays. Actually, I think Woolf at a certain point tries to disavow the word novel. She doesn't write novels. So finds it a too constraining definition generically. Maybe again because of the way the way reality is supposed to be represented in the novel. And she talks about the awful business of the realist novelist having to write about what happens between breakfast and dinner. And all imaginative writers, I think, would want to find ways of being liberated from whatever conventions we're supposed to follow as novelists, which either as realist novelists asks us to describe what happened in the day between breakfast and dinner to the protagonist, or as a magic realist novelist, you actually end up following the same conventions. You have to produce the flying elephant at a certain point of time. You know, there are certain conventions you have to follow. Now, the people who disrupt those are certain novelists like Proust, like Virginia Woolf, but there are also essayists and critics like Roland Barthes. It doesn't always matter whether or not you've read the kind of writer that Roland Barthes is writing of. And this is carried to its extreme by Borges, whom Alberto Manguel mentioned. That, Borges is writing often about imaginary writers, or he's writing mock criticism, which are revelatory. I think of Pierre Menard, the author of The Quixote, which is an astonishing piece of writing. So I would say that the distinction is between whether we are going to be shackled by ideas of representing reality which came about at a certain point of time in European history, or whether we are not going to be shackled by them. And whether you unshackle yourself via the essay, via the novel, or by any other form, that's the main question for me.
I just want to correct a detail in what Will said. My first language, in spite of my accent, is English. I learned Spanish when I was 8. But speaking about the essay and the novel, or the review and the novel, we have to remember that reviewing is an invention of the 19th century or the late 18th century, and certainly related, as you said, to journalism. Before there were official papers and magazines, there were no reviews. People wrote about what they read as they wrote about how they traveled, or they wrote about the people they met, so they didn't make any rules about that. And then the rules were created, I think, by the papers, not by the writers. So you get certain styles attached to certain reviews and certain papers. There's the New Yorker kind of review, or the New York Book Review kind of review, or the Times Literary Supplement, which always has to include a clause beginning, when it praises the book, it has to include a clause that begins with, however. This is what Chesterton called reviewing Martin Chuzzlewit and saying, it's a good book, nevertheless, it doesn't shed any light on the marital customs in Norway.
Great. Will, I meant to ask you, there's a fairly recent development in the history of literature is the arrival of a double language in criticism. One is the language of academia, and the other is the language of journalism, and maybe there's something in the middle on the line of them both. And I wanted, oh, you can't hear me? I wanted to ask you, where does the word narrator first begin to appear in criticism, and does it come from the university, or did it evolve organically from people writing reviews? And other terms in fiction, omniscient narration, the third-person narrator, what do you feel like academic criticism has a value in a kind of trickle-down effect that finally makes even journalistic criticism more rigorous?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting point to raise. I'm sure both Alberto and Nicholson will know more about this than I do. I mean, my perception is that, to give it you very, very broad brush, is that the problem for literary criticism in the 20th century is summed up by one word, and that's Wittgenstein. And the problem for literary criticism is that the practice of metaphysics became extremely difficult after the publication of the philosophical investigations in the 1950s. And all of these people who were philosophically inclined and wanted to say something about those rather numinous questions about our existence and the world migrated into the field of literary studies under the flag of a group of French people. They're very nice, but a bit humorless. And they decided to start treating literary texts as the world. It's a rather Borgesian conceit. Actually, Borges would go to town on it and did. And that's where a lot of these particular taxonomy and terminology comes from. And of course, there have been several generations now of critics who have grown up in this environment and have been force-fed Derrida and Barthes and various kind of systems, and Genet, various systems of classification. So Bowdlerized forms of these terms now enter the kind of marketplace of general criticism. Some of them are more useful than others. I mean, obviously it's useful to have a basic terminology to discuss the parts of fictional texts and to understand them, but they're normally deployed with a certain kind of false legerdemain in order, coming back to my initial dichotomy, to reinforce the notion of authority on the part of the critic. They're there in the grab bag in order to kind of both slap the writer down and slap the reader of the critic down with their ignorance and cupidity. So I think we all know that kind of criticism is pretty bogus. I think we all know that fictional texts are not the world, and coming back to what Amit was saying, there is a fundamental distinction between writing about the world and writing about other texts. And Borges may be the writer who plays most convincingly with the ontological queasiness that's involved in that. But nonetheless, it doesn't make him, not a fiction writer, in my view.
Amit, I wanted to ask you about an act of criticism which is, however, not writing. And this point came home to me when I was still a student in college, when I went into a bookshop and saw the Vintage Book of Indian Literature, which you did, the second book by you I read. And in that you had presented your own view of Indian literature, and the excerpts from short stories or poems from across Indian languages and sometimes in English. And there was an introduction by you at the beginning and then short introduction to each of the writers, and it was something that I enjoyed a lot. And it is part of the critic's job at some level, isn't it, to like reorganize the canon a little bit, or even to make a new interpretation?
About that particular anthology in a second. Just to say that yes, whether it's Wittgenstein or Derrida or post-structuralism, yes, they a kind of vulgarized version of them for a while kind of paralyzed critical thinking. Added authority maybe, but paralyzed it. But it kind of, if you actually read Derrida or read these people, I mean, not that I have read them very much, but if you read them a tiny bit, you realize that none of them can be actually put into this kind of generalized, in the service of this generalized, what somebody called a criticism of suspicion, a hermeneutics, an interpretation of suspicion, in whose service they've been put, so they actually had a very nuanced and rich feeling for literature. Many of these major theorists like Foucault or Derrida, while they are represented to us in a completely anti-literary way. The other thing, since we've been talking about reviewing, the other thing I quickly wanted to add before I come to the vintage anthology is that now in India we have a different situation. In India we have had the Indian languages, the Indian modern languages, and Indian sort of modern traditions and critics and writers. In the English language in India, the whole idea of Indian writing and Indian writing in English was given a fresh boost, as you know, by the publication of Midnight's Children, which somehow came just in time, just 9 years or 10 years before economic deregulation, liberalization, and the Indian boom. So it became a part of India globalizing, the Indian economy booming story, that whole feel-good story. Indian writing in English became a part of that story. in the wake of that came also criticism written by bewildered people, not authoritative, but bewildered and in some ways strident. They were not quoting Derrida or even a huge amount of literature. And a lot of that criticism was a form of, now I understand, since we're looking at terms, a form of trolling. You know? That's the only kind of term you can use for that. Kind of the Indian variety of the ad hominem attack post-Rushdie. So it's taken a while for people to begin to engage with things without thinking, you know, has he sold out to the Western marketplace? Is he exoticizing things? These were the kind of usual responses. Now, so we must put that context there in place for Indian reviewing, that is in English. As far as the anthology of Indian literature was concerned, I mean, how do you make sense of something called Indian literature? It's as impossible to arrive at something called Indian literature by adding up, you know, Gujarati, Maithili, English, Marathi, etc., and adding them up proportionately, saying to yourself that there are, you know, 10% of the population is Maharashtrian, so we must have 10% of the anthology represented by Marathi writing. It's as impossible to do that as it is for a creative writer to come up with a character by first kind of thinking of a face and then adding a mustache and then making the eyes green or brown. That's not how you come up with character, and you cannot, you know, and then filling the character in with thoughts. The character becomes a kind of decanter, and you pour the psychology inside. So you can't do that with a character, and you can't come up with Indian writing in the same way. The whole business was, can I presume to say that I've read such and such people? One person wrote in Bengali in the 19th century, and here's another person who wrote in the 20th century, like Salman Rushdie. Salman Rushdie and Michael Madhusudhan Dutt. Can I put them in the same book? Does the juxtaposition suggest a relationship, a kind of you know, energy of some kind? And what is that? How do you make sense of that? Is that does some kind of idea of Indian literature begin to emerge from these juxtapositions put together? It's a way of, maybe it's the bricoleur's way of writing fiction. You know, Walter Benjamin said, I want to write a book completely composed of quotations. He never did that, but this was such a book, the vintage book of Indian literature, the Picador book of Indian literature.
Walter Benjamin said, I want to write a book completely made up of quotations. One of the most exciting books of criticism I ever read was when I was a student of English literature, and I used to hate writing these essays. And in a bookshop around my house, I found a book by Borges called The Chronicles of Bustos Domecq. I don't know if you've read it, Alberto. And the first chapter was about this critic and this writer. It was a satire on T.S. Eliot, who, because of Eliot said that all these great works have to have allusions to other works.
About the northwest corner of his desk. It's a vast novel, and he's encouraged to write a sequel which will be simply North, and so on. And the essay that you mentioned, yes, is a mockery of the T.S. Eliot method of writing. However, Borges did the same thing, and I think that we all who write more or less do that. Readers, of course, do that. They compile books in their heads made of the quotations they like, and sometimes improved in the memory of the reader. But we all write not from our experience, whatever novelists might tell you, but from what we have read about what we think is our experience and of the memory of what we have read. And so we write with borrowed words always. So Borges's satire was true, but also was a mirror of his own writing, which, to answer your question briefly, yes, was criticism.
I'm going to ask one last question before we take questions from you, and that's for you, Nicholson. The most impressive work of criticism I can remember reading the last 3 or 4 months was actually a chapter in a novel by an Israeli writer called Ofer Tushegafla, and in it, two people meet in Israel, a man and a woman, and one of them is reading a Rushdie novel, actually, and the other one, the woman says, I like that very much too, and they begin to speak about Rushdie. And they're both big Rushdie fans, and the entire chapter goes in them saying, I love this thing about that book, but don't you feel makes this kind of mistake? And by the end of it, they realize they're in love with one another, and they continue to see each other and exchange, and almost talk to each other through Rushdie. And do you feel that there is a place even in novels for criticism of that kind? Because
Absolutely. I think the problem of being a critic is it really matters. I mean, everyone in this room is a critic, and you're very fortunate in that when you're writing and when you're reading and you don't like something, you don't have to finish the review. You just close the book and put it away, and it's a lovely privilege. But we're all reading books, and we all have complicated thoughts about them, and so novels that don't talk about that are leaving something really crucially important out. And in fact, I tried to address this in a couple of books back, a book called The Anthologist. And the guy was trying to create an anthology of rhyming poetry. This was my character's task. And he didn't want to do it, and he had a terrible time doing it. He went up in the barn and he sang. He set poems to music rather than doing it. He came back and apologized to his wife rather than doing it. But in any case, his job was to create, in a sense, this kind of anthology that you're talking about. The job of the novel was to figure out how all these thoughts about all the poets that he had read fit into a life. And I do think that, I mean, I'm very interested in the book. I haven't read the novel that you described, but I think it's crucial to have novels be able to treat the life of the reading mind intelligently, because that's what we are. We're reading and thinking and trying to be human, trying to be nice people, but we're trying to be intelligent readers as part of what we do every day. So it's tough.
great. Who wants to ask a question? And if you want to address one of them in particular, you should do that as well. Yes, you and then.
As someone who's studied both literary criticism and creative writing, I personally found that there was a huge gap between how the professors of literary criticism approached what they taught and what the ones teaching creative writing were doing. They both at times seemed oblivious to each other. They both could be talking about Hemingway, but the approach was not reconciliatory at all. So my question here is, one, do you agree with this? Do you think there's a gap in the way it's being taught? And if it is so, why is it so? And what can be done about it? Why do the people who teach or study creative writing, even if that's a farce, do not appreciate in a way how the critical thinking goes? I don't know. I felt that perhaps there were times when there was enough criticism about the written, but there was not enough criticism about writing. Maybe James Wood did it well. Moretti does it in one of his pieces quantitatively. But on the whole, there's very little criticism about writing. There's more about the written. Do you see that as a distinction?
I want to say, there's in American elementary schools now and junior high schools, people are taught about omniscient narrators, first person, third person. Why? Because the vocabulary of criticism, that is, these certain ideas, is easier to teach than actually to teach what it means to be a fully human reader who reads a book and just says, wow, that was an amazing story. There's nothing to be said about that. You just lived through a really nifty story. So instead, they teach really complicated words like omniscient narrator, which perfectly nice word, but it actually distracts from the pleasure of reading. So it's a problem, but it's a problem because teachers need something to teach, and need something to teach, they need something to write on the board. They need complicated words that you memorize.
Well, I don't think that teaching creative writing is a field of academic study. It's actually a kind of pyramid selling scheme in which writers who can't make a living writing encourage other people to become like them. So it's something quite distinct. I will say this, though, for the creative writing field, which I think actually is symptomatic of the end of the kind of literary culture that we've all become accustomed to. It's the kind of terminal moraine at the end of print. It's the creative writing MFA, and all the works produced on it. But there is a distinction, and I will say this for creative writing, there is a distinction, at least people who endeavor to teach creative writing understand this, because most of them are failed writers, or struggling writers. Let's not be too blanket in all of this, and I've been known to do a little bit myself. At least we understand that a writer is crucial to a text. In other words, a text needs an author, whereas the prevailing school in critical theory in the English-speaking world and other language fields is that the writer is an irrelevance and that all texts can be judged within their own parameters, which is actually wholly bogus, and it's an outgrowth of a patriarchal, largely white, largely bourgeois perspective on what literature is. So that kind of incommensurability between the two is systemic and can never go away. You're absolutely right.
Thank you. Now, Amit ji, you are mentioning about the contemporary field of criticism. The contemporary field of critical engagement, in which some of the philosophical reflections have been used in a very naive and immature way. Now, the point is that the whole field of critical engagement, the discussion emerging in a place like India, it also needs to build upon the very creative fields of critical engagement in mother languages, in Odia, in Bengali, in Karnataka, where some of the very creative minds, creative writers are also critics. And that mode of engagement is also providing a different mode of critique. The critic is not just the person who slaps you. The critic is also a friend. So it also invites us to go beyond the limited universe of discourse that we are used to. My second query, very briefly, is your reflection on the nature of the contemporary novel. That the kind of the border crossing you are suggesting, now in what way it needs to be carried further? Can we think of a novel containing prose, poetry, and painting? And finally, my query to...
I think two questions are good from one person, and
if I can very quickly...
No, sir, you'll have to sit down. There are other people who also want to ask questions.
Just quickly touch on the earlier question as well, and maybe try to connect it with this. And we are completely run out of time, haven't we? Yeah. So, well, I have to sort of shape my profundities and to compress them. The first thing I want to point out is that the idea that writers, creative writers, think that thinking is anathema, that they cannot be intellectuals, is an Anglo-American prejudice. You move outside of the English-speaking world, and I don't think you encounter this particular prejudice. In the Anglo-American world, the writer is supposed to tell you about which pen he uses, or whether he writes on his laptop or still writes by longhand, or what kind of notebook he uses. That's the extent. It's a fetishizing of the magical qualities of a writer that we hear about in the Anglo-American world. People, if you begin to talk to them about philosophy, the Anglo-American creative writer immediately thinks, I'm going to stop being creative. It's a romantic prejudice going straight back to the idea that Coleridge was a failure, while Wordsworth was a success because Coleridge thought too much. You know, And once you step out of the Anglo-American or the English-speaking world into other cultures, you find this nervousness just doesn't exist. As far as creative writing teaching is concerned, of course, the problem is intense in America, where we know that they have been writing about it, that creative writing teachers are people who have written maybe one novel, which has barely been published, and then they begin to teach creative writing, and then there's this whole kind of problem to do with it being a self-generating, self-perpetuating, self-regurgitating sort of machine. But also what's true of the whole creative writing industry vis-a-vis the literature industry is that something happened in the 90s, partly to do with what Will mentioned earlier, the effect of critical theory. Critical theory made it impossible for respectable academics to talk about literature anymore. They just didn't want to talk about literature. They talked about sociology. They might have been talking about Jane Austen, but they were actually talking about sociology. And in the creative writing departments, they were untainted by theory. They were untainted by any thought. They only thought about commas. The ghost of Flaubert dominated. Only the good word, the right word was important. And you had this bifurcation. I don't think it has to be like that. It doesn't have to be like that. We can survive thinking, us creative writers. We will not die if we think. So now, yeah. So should we end it there?
I'm sorry to say we've run out of time, but all of them will be around to take all your questions in person. So thank you so much for coming at the end of a very long day, and
I'd like to thank.
will there be a book signing?
Yeah, absolutely. The book signing is all happening at the Amazon bookstore. So I would request you all to proceed to there. Very quickly, there's a short announcement, ladies and gentlemen. We are actually having the DSC Literature Prize being awarded over here in the Baithak. We would request everybody, and this is slightly inconvenient, but because of the rain, it was supposed to have happened in the front lawns. It's happening here, so we need to do a technical reorganization of the venue. So we request everybody to kind of step out for 10 or 15 minutes while we're allowed to do that, and you'll all be let back in. It's an open event. It's not a closed-off event, but we do need 10 or 15 minutes to just reorganize ourselves in here for the prize event. Thank you. Thank you so much for your cooperation, and I hope you had a wonderful second day at the Jaipur Literature Festival 2015, brought to you by Rajnigandha.